The junk moons of Zephyr were where broken things went to die. Spanning thousands of square kilometers, the landscape was a graveyard of forgotten machines, gutted ships, rusting exosuits, and fractured satellite husks. Once a jewel in the Imperial recycling circuits, Zephyr had been abandoned centuries ago, now a place where the dead technology of 1,000 fallen empires slumbered beneath ash-colored skies and the shriek of solar wind. But today, beneath the jagged ribs of a downed royal cruiser, something still lived. She lay motionless under layers of metallic debris, her once luminous skin dulled by soot and blood. Her legs were twisted beneath the frame of what had once been a ceremonial cannon, now nothing more than a corroded relic pressing bone to scrap. The shattered shards of a crown were still tangled in her violet hair. Her name was Vyra, and once she had been royalty. Born to the House of Verox, heiress to the Valerian Imperium, Vyra had not been designed to fail. She had been forged in the crucible of palace chambers, trained to outthink diplomats and overpower generals. But she had also questioned, she had challenged, she had refused to accept cruelty disguised as tradition. And for that, for her voice, for her defiance, for her strength that didn't bow, she had been cast out. Her father had dragged her into the throne chamber after she dared to speak against the execution of dissenters, had spoken no words, only offered her to the guards. They broke her legs in the presence of courtiers, and when she still refused to scream, when her eyes met his with cold fire, he exiled her. No prison, no trial. Just an unmarked shuttle launched into the orbit of a forgotten moon. "Let the scavengers take her," he had said. That had been 4 days ago. She had crawled through the wreckage of her shuttle, bleeding, bones shattered, mouth dry. But Zephyr had no mercy. Her injuries worsened, her cybernetics fried by radiation. Her body failed faster than her spirit did, and yet it too began to slip. Not to death, but to something slower, irrelevance. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't moved. The clouds above had begun to filter the starlight into pale gold when the shriek of an engine broke the silence. Vyra didn't lift her head. Her lips were cracked, her breathing shallow, but the engine came closer. The hum changed pitch. Closer still. It slowed, then stopped. She forced her eyes open. A human stood above her. He was rough around the edges, sweat-soaked in a torn mechanic's jacket. His beard was unkempt, his brow furrowed beneath a grease-smeared visor. He looked at her with a mixture of confusion and disbelief, like someone expecting to find a pile of junk and discovering instead a broken star. He dropped his toolkit, crouched beside her. "You're alive," he said, more to himself than to her. Vyra tried to speak, but no sound came. He lifted the debris carefully, gently sliding a stabilizer bar beneath her back. "Easy," he muttered. "I've got you." She didn't know his name, didn't know if he was real. Her vision blurred and sharpened by turns. But as his hand steadied her, she heard herself whisper, "I am not broken." The human blinked, then gave her a slow, crooked smile. "No," he said, "you're just waiting to be rebuilt." And then everything went dark. The sound of steam hissing from a nearby vent pulled Vyra from the void. She opened her eyes slowly, prepared for pain, but found only weight, heavy limbs, dulled nerves, and a soft hum beneath her spine. She was lying on a slab of worn plastisteel, draped in a heat cloak. Overhead, a cracked skylight filtered warm light across tangled wires and shelves of dismantled machinery. The smell of oil and solder filled her senses. The junkyard was gone. Or at least, she was no longer dying in it. She turned her head with effort and saw him. He was welding something by the wall, sparks flying like fireflies as he leaned over a hovering exo-rig frame. She recognized him instantly, the human who had found her. His jacket now hung from a hook beside a deactivated battle drone. He wore a simple tank shirt now, his arms stained with work, focused, steady. She tried to speak, but her throat was sandpaper. He heard her rustle and turned. "You're awake," he said, crossing to her with quick, confident steps. He held a cup to her lips, carefully helping her sip the cool, bitter fluid. It wasn't pleasant, but it steadied her. "Where?" she rasped. "Salvage Hangar 19B. I run it." "You were in bad shape." She blinked. "My legs." His expression flickered. "Crushed. Nerve damage, both femurs shattered." She didn't need a diagnosis. She already knew. She had lived it. "You're lucky I found you," he added. "You were buried under a reactor wing. If I'd shown up a few hours later." "I wouldn't be lucky. Just dead," she murmured. He exhaled through his nose. I've seen your kind die for less. My kind? You're Valerian, aren't you? Royal blood by the look of that armor, or what's left of it. Vira's eyes narrowed. You recognize Imperial sigils? I've rebuilt ships that ran from your Empire's guns. He shrugged. I know what they look like. You should have left me, she said, not unkindly. It would have been easier. Probably, he replied. But I don't make a habit of leaving people buried alive. Doesn't sit well with me. She studied him now. Beneath the grease and the tiredness, there was something in his eyes, something unsaid, a weight that matched her own. What's your name? She asked. Jake Marlowe. She let the name linger in her mind, foreign yet solid. I'm Vira, she said, daughter of Verox, or was. Jake raised a brow. Wait, the Verox? The Emperor of Valaris? Her silence was confirmation enough. He let out a long whistle and stepped back, folding his arms. Well then, he said, looks like I dragged a galactic bomb into my shop. I won't explode, Vira muttered. Jake grinned. Let's hope not, because I just started rebuilding your body. Would be a real shame to waste good metal on royalty. Vira closed her eyes and felt the beginnings of something unfamiliar spark in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but something close. Maybe even trust. The hum of repulsor drills echoed softly through the makeshift workshop, a rhythmic song of work and wear that filled the silence between breaths. Vira sat propped upright in a diagnostic chair, her torso cradled by a suspension harness, while her legs, no longer functional, skeletal fragments encased in crushed armor, were being removed with surgical precision. Her jaw clenched each time a nerve sang out in defiance, but she made no sound. Jake knelt at her side, his hands steady as he unbolted the last fragment of bone-hugging cybernetic frame from her thigh. The worn-out servos snapped loose with a sharp hiss, revealing pale blue skin marred by bruises and deep scarring. He worked with the concentration of a surgeon and the gentleness of a man who knew too well what it meant to carry pain that had settled into the soul. Your old interface implants are beyond salvage, he said, not looking up. Half of them were fused into your nervous tissue. Whoever designed these didn't think you'd survive long enough for them to matter. Vira let out a breath that shook at the edges. They were ceremonial units, meant to make me look more imposing during palace proceedings. Style before substance, like everything else in that place. Jake raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Instead, he gestured toward the wall where several prototypes stood upright, models of different prosthetic designs he'd scavenged, retrofitted, or entirely built from scratch. Unlike the pristine limbs from a royal medbay, these were raw, honest things. Alloy bones, magnetically synchronized tendons, exposed servos humming with potential. Not elegant, but strong, real. You're not going to walk again with something pretty, he said. You're going to walk again with something angry. She turned to look at the prototypes, her lips pressing into a line. Angry is all I have left. Good, he replied, because that's what I build for. She stared at the limbs for a long time. One of them was built from the core assembly of a mining rig. Another bore pieces of what looked like an old Virexian warframe. These weren't made for elegance. They were made for survival. And maybe for vengeance. Jake finally glanced at her face. You don't talk much about what happened after you were exiled. There's nothing left to say, she answered. My father saw me as a weakness. My voice threatened his control. When I opposed him publicly, he broke my legs in front of the council and left me to rot in silence. He calls it tradition. I call it cowardice. Jake nodded slowly. And now I wait for a reason to live. His hands froze for a moment over the metal components. Then let me give you one, he said. Not for revenge, not for him, but for you. He picked up the first of the prosthetics, a sleek, jointed alloy frame with triple rotor articulation, and held it beside her. This one's not palace approved, but it might just let you punch a hole through a titanium wall. Vira didn't smile, but the tension in her shoulders loosened just enough to be felt. When do we start? Jake placed the limb on the bench beside her. We already did. The first step came on the 12th day. Jake stood behind her, the diagnostic pads pressed to her back, reading every twitch of nerve data while the mechanical braces began their silent dance. Vira's new legs, still unpainted, wires exposed and humming, were linked to her neural command relays through an interface that Jake had soldered by hand. There was no support frame now, no artificial suspension, just her, and the ground beneath her. Her first attempt failed. So did the second. The third ended with a scream and a crack of metal against the floor as her balance slipped and she collapsed hard onto the platform. Jake rushed forward, but she waved him off with a snarl. "Don't help me." "Vira, I said don't," she hissed, breath coming in gasps. "I wasn't built to be rescued." He stood back, his hands curled into fists, his jaw tight. But he let her do it. She rose again, shoulders trembling, legs twitching beneath her like an animal learning to move again after a long sleep. And then one slow, staggering step forward. Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Vira's head lifted. Her violet eyes blazed. "I don't want to reclaim my throne," she said, voice hard as steel. "I want to tear the concept of a throne apart. Brick by brick, law by law." Jake tilted his head. "That's a hell of a mission." "It's a start." After that, the days bled into each other. Repairs, recalibrations, more steps, more falling, then more standing. She learned how to fight again, this time not with the elegance of a court-trained heir, but with the brutal efficiency of someone who knew what pain felt like and wasn't afraid of it anymore. Jake installed combat overrides, torque boosters, pressure regulators, not because she asked for them, but because she would have built them herself if he hadn't. Some nights, they talked over broken circuits and reheated rations. She told him about the chambers carved into black diamond at the palace, about how the light never reached the lower halls, about the girls who had gone quiet after speaking out, about the days she had counted from behind gold-plated walls like they were prison bars. He told her about Earth, about the noise, the sky, the cities that never slept, and the machines that were never quite silent, about the corruption that had cost him his position, the innovation that had made him a threat, and the exile that had become his second chance. "We're both discards," she said once, "thrown into the trash to rot." "Yeah," he answered, "and look what we're building from it." There was no ceremony on the days she walked unaided across the workshop. Just the quiet sound of metal against metal, her boots clanking onto the deck one step at a time. Jake didn't clap, Vira didn't smile, but the look they shared said everything. She wasn't the same woman who had been left for dead beneath the wreckage. She was someone else now, someone reborn in the bones of steel and the fire of will, and she was far from finished. The SciFi Junkyard had changed, not in structure. The hills of shattered ships, rusting cargo hulls, and fractured satellites still sprawled endlessly in all directions, but in presence. The silence that had once hung like a shroud was now charged with something alive, something volatile. Word had spread as it always did in places where nothing should matter. The mechanic with hands like gods had brought someone back from the brink. And not just anyone. A Valarian princess. A ghost thought buried. Vira moved through the scrapyard with purpose now. Her new legs, no longer prototypes but forged extensions of her will, moved with a predatory grace, part dancer, part machine. She no longer limped, she no longer hesitated, and she no longer wore the royal colors of her lineage. Jake had made her a frame chassis cloak from the melt-resistant plating of an old warcruiser, etched with markings neither Valarian nor human, symbols of survival, of reclamation. He watched her from the upper balcony of his repurposed repair hangar, arms folded, eyes shaded beneath a cracked visor. She had become something more than what he'd expected. Not just a survivor, not even a queen in exile. She had become inevitable, but with that came danger. They came on a morning laced with ash-colored sky and too much quiet. 3 skiffs, sleek and black, hovering on antigrav thrusters that barely whispered. Each bore the sigil of House Varrock's, her father's mark, burnt into the side in gold, a show of force or a retrieval. Jake spotted them first. He rushed to Vira, who was running diagnostics on her gauntlet interface beside a broken orbital lifter. "We've got company," he said simply. She didn't flinch. "From the skies? 3 ships, Royal Crest, low emissions. They're not here to talk." Vira rose, pressing her fingers into her palm. Her limbs hissed as her neural sync tightened. "Then they'll leave in pieces." Jake reached for his tool belt, slinging a coil rifle across his back and securing the exosuit plating over his shoulders. "You sure about this? We could still run." "I've run before," she said. "Look where it got me." The skiffs touched down with ceremonial silence, their doors unfolding like wings. From the lead ship stepped a man draped in regal armor, plated silver, trimmed in red glass, A general, not a diplomat. His face was not unkind, but it was sharp, deliberate, and dangerous in the way a scalpel is before the first cut. "Vyra Verox," he said, voice calm. "Your father requests your return." She stepped forward, cloak trailing behind her like smoke. "He's made that request before. This time I decline with a blade." The general inclined his head. "You're in no position to threaten the throne. You're one exile, one cripple, hiding in a tomb of failed worlds." Jake stepped beside her. "She's not alone, and she's not crippled." The general glanced at Jake, his lip curling. A human, of course. They always love strays, until they realize how much noise broken things make. Without a signal, the soldiers moved. Vyra was faster. Her limbs ignited with energy, servos whining as she launched into the lead attacker, her gauntlet slamming through plated armor like glass. Jake fired into the second wave, each blast targeted and brutal. He didn't shoot to kill, but he did shoot to send a message. They fought not like rebels, not like fugitives, but like a system rebelling against its designer. Metal clashed, ground fractured, sparks flew. When it ended, only the general still stood, his sword lowered, his breathing ragged. "You should have stayed broken," he whispered. Vyra walked to him, her boots splashed with oil and dust. "I was never broken," she said, "just discarded." She let him live, not out of mercy, but because his defeat would spread faster than his death. After the ships limped away, Jake helped her clean the blood from her frame. He didn't speak for a long time. Neither did she. Then, as he adjusted a cracked note on her shoulder, she said quietly, "He'll come himself next time." Jake met her gaze. "Then we make him regret it." She didn't smile, but her hand touched his, and that was enough. Jake's workshop became a fortress in the weeks that followed. The quiet that had once defined Zephyr Mine was now alive with purpose. The salvage drones were repurposed into scouts. Automated turrets were mounted along the Junkyard's perimeter, buried under rusted sheet metal. Power cores from long-dead cruisers were reignited, their cores humming with energy not seen since the last war. But none of it matched what Jake was building in secret. It started as sketches, then schematics, then rough constructs welded together behind locked blast doors where only Vyra was allowed to enter. "You're building a ship," she said one night, staring at the skeletal frame rising above them. Jake adjusted the projection. A drop-frame assault vessel, hybrid core, designed to cut through blockade layers, tapped with shield modulation based on the old rebel deflector grids. She looked at him with narrowed eyes. "Why? Because your father won't let you be free. And I'm tired of watching empires crush the ones who refuse to kneel." Vyra walked slowly around the frame, running her hand along the raw alloy ribs. "You'd risk that? For me?" He didn't look at her. Just kept working. "I already have." There was a silence between them that felt heavier than metal. Finally, she said, "You're not like the others." "No," he replied. "I was born on Earth. We were taught to fight for what matters, and I've never seen anything matter more than you." She stopped walking. Her voice was quieter now. "I don't know what I am anymore. I'm not a princess. I'm not a soldier. I'm a hybrid of ash and armor." Jake turned to face her. "Then let's make that your title." She blinked. "You're not the daughter of Verox anymore," he said. "You're Vyra of the Iron Reclaim. You don't need a throne. You need a war engine, one with your name written in stars." Her breath trembled. Then slowly, her hand reached out and pressed to his chest. Not with the strength of her frame, but with the honesty of flesh. "Then build it," she whispered. "And when it flies, I'll make the stars remember me." And Jake, with his grease-stained hands and machine-born soul, nodded. He didn't just want to save her anymore. He wanted to help her reshape the galaxy. The ship came alive in pieces. Like a myth stitched together with wrenches and willpower, its bones grew from the rusted husks of warships long forgotten. Jake worked by firelight and plasma torch, welding dreams into alloy. Vyra stood beside him through every stage, not as an overseer, but as a co-creator. Her hands were sharp, her mind sharper. She revised power grids, reprogrammed old Coalition nav software, and even soldered panels when Jake's hands grew too sore to finish the job. They called it the Morning Star. Not as a tribute to what they'd lost, but to what refused to die. It wasn't just a ship. It was a message. An exiled heir and a human exile, building something too strong to bury and too fast to catch. Its drive core was taken from a wrecked stealth cruiser, its wings from an atmospheric glider, its belly carried cannon ports designed to punch through dreadnoughts, and its cockpit bore a single personal crest etched into the glass. Vyra's sigil crossed through her father's crest like a blade splitting a lie. During the long nights, they spoke in half-sentences while welding armor plating. Jake told her about the resistance movements back on Earth, about how people lost their way when they stopped believing they could fix things. Vyra spoke less of her past now, and more of her vision. A galaxy where bloodlines meant less than choices, where broken things weren't discarded, they were reforged. "You know," Jake said one night while repairing one of her leg stabilizers, "you don't have to fight him directly. You could disappear, live in the fringe zones, stay hidden." Vyra tilted her head. "And wait for someone else to speak while my people are silenced? No." He exhaled. "Then we'll build more than a ship. We'll build a revolution." The first time Vyra piloted the ship, it rose from the junkyard like a phoenix from grave ash. The rusted soil blew outward in rings of fire as the thrusters lit. The morning star soared up into the storm-colored skies and screamed toward the clouds, trailing fire, defiance, and promise. She laughed as it spun through the stratosphere. Not the laugh of a monarch or a warrior, but something feral, something free. Jake sat beside her in the co-pilot's seat, gripping the edge of the console as she pushed the ship harder, faster, until they broke into orbit and looked down at the world that had once tried to consume her. In that moment, Jake realized something. He had never truly been in awe of royalty, or power, or war, but he was in awe of her, and he would follow her to the edge of any battlefield, not as her soldier, not as her servant, as her equal. The message came as expected. A fleet, dispatched by King Verox himself, had locked onto the Morning Star's emissions and traced it to Zephyr Meinth. A dozen royal warships, with their sleek black hulls and cruel designs, now orbited the junkyard moon like vultures circling a corpse that wouldn't stay dead. They didn't send threats. They sent a simple broadcast, filled with static and disdain. Return the stolen prototype and the exile aboard it, or be reduced to ash. Jake played the message twice, then deleted it. Vyra didn't speak for a long time. She stood in the docking bay of the Morning Star, clad in the final version of her battle suit. The braces on her legs were now fully integrated. Not just supports, but weapons. Her arms bore wrist-mounted repulsor gauntlets. Her spine was threaded with neural filament linked directly into the ship's command systems. She was no longer just a person. She was a machine of justice, built by pain and choice. "They think I'm still the child they crippled," she said. "They don't understand that I've been remade in flame." Jake stood beside her, strapping into his harness, his plasma cannon humming at his back. "We hit the flagship first," he said. "Break the chain of command. The others might scatter without their beastmaster." She nodded. "You take port flank. I'll handle the primary defense grid." He glanced at her, a question lingering in his eyes. "You sure you're ready for this?" She didn't answer. She simply walked to the control panel and opened the ship's comms channel. To the fleet orbiting above, she sent a single message, her voice calm and cold. "I am Vyra. You discarded me, broke me, buried me, but I rose, and now I come not for vengeance, only for truth. If you stand in its way, you will fall." The Morning Star launched like a spear through the atmosphere, fire trailing its wings. Enemy ships opened fire, but Vyra weaved through their formation like a storm through stars, her body moving in harmony with the ship itself. Missiles erupted in brilliant light. Turrets exploded. Warships cracked open as Jake's targeting systems painted weak points like arteries waiting to bleed. The flagship loomed ahead, a floating palace in the void, surrounded by a ring of escort fighters. Vyra surged forward. Her hands danced over the console, her neural sync peaking, her exo-enhanced limbs driving power directly into the ship's reactor. She didn't aim for the hull. She aimed for the heart. The Morning Star slammed into the flagship's defense core with surgical precision, cutting power across their outer decks. Within minutes, boarding lines were locked, and Vyra dropped from the breached tunnel into the corridor she'd once walked as a daughter. Jake followed, sidearm blazing, clearing a path. No one stood a chance. By the time they reached the throne chamber, the guards had fled. King Verox sat alone, older now, colder, but no less cruel. He rose slowly, gaze sweeping over Vyra's frame. "You were supposed to die." I did, she said, and then I was born again. His hand reached for the emergency trigger beneath his throne, but a blast from Jake's cannon vaporized the mechanism. Vira walked to her father and stared into the face that had ordered her broken. You thought you buried me in silence, she whispered, but I was only sleeping beneath the noise. And then she stepped past him. She didn't strike him, didn't kill him, because this wasn't about vengeance, this was about being seen. She activated her gauntlet, and the entire chamber broadcasted to every channel in the Empire. Her voice, once silenced, now echoed across 1,000 worlds. I am Vira of the Iron Reclaim. I am not your princess. I am your future. If you still serve power born of cruelty, step aside. If you believe in something better, rise. Jake watched her, awe still lingering in his chest. The Empire would never be the same. And neither would they. The palace throne room had always been a monument to intimidation. Towering obsidian columns, an arched ceiling carved from starlit glass, and a dais that loomed like a black fang above all who dared approach. It was built for kings, for judgment, and for fear. But now it stood silent, watched by cameras broadcasting to every colony in the Valerian Empire. Across light years, rebels, workers, scholars, and soldiers leaned into their displays, not to hear a king speak, but to listen to the daughter he discarded. Vira didn't raise her voice as she stood before the throne. She didn't need to. It carried anyway, clear, cold, powerful. Behind her, Jake stood like iron, his cannon slung low, his breath steady. He had no crown, no title, but he wore the weight of every moment like it was welded to his bones. I am not here to demand the throne, Vira said, turning to face the rows of nobles who had dared show their faces. I do not want the chains my father wore and passed on like heirlooms. I am here because I survived what he could not. Truth. She looked to Verox, her father, who remained seated though the throne's authority had long since collapsed beneath him. His face was pale, not from fear, but from the creeping realization that he could not stop what was already in motion. His daughter, crippled, exiled, reborn in steel and fire, was rewriting the narrative that had built his reign. You called me a broken thing, Vira said, but it was this system that was broken, this empire of silence and obedience. You built it on fear, father, but now it will answer to its people. There were no cheers, no shouts of support, only silence, reverent, trembling silence. Jake stepped forward and placed a hand on Vira's shoulder, not to claim the moment but to share it. And it grounded her, reminded her of who she had become, not just someone who had risen, but someone who had chosen not to fall again. Verox finally spoke, his voice dry and cracked. You think you've won? Vira's answer was a whisper. No, I've only begun. She turned away from the throne and left the room, her cloak dragging the broken crown she had torn from the throne's armrest behind her like refuse. The transmission cut out seconds later, but the message remained. Across the Empire, ships lowered their flags. Sectors long dormant with rebellion began to stir. And in places where her name had once been banned, it was now spoken like a signal flare. Outside the palace, the morning star waited. Jake helped her board the ramp. His hand lingered at her back, and for a moment, neither spoke. Then Vira turned to him. I didn't want to lead, she said quietly. I just wanted to be free. You're both now, Jake replied. And you're not doing it alone. The engines roared as they ascended, fire carving a path through the cold clouds of Valeris. For the first time in generations, the people of the Empire looked up, not to a symbol of conquest, but to a ship built from the bones of failure, carrying the only heir they trusted. One not born to rule, but forged to change everything. They didn't return to Zephyr Menx. That world had done its part. It had served as crucible, as sanctuary, and as grave. But Vira didn't belong to graves anymore. She belonged to what came after. They made their base on an old mining colony near the rim, long abandoned and untouched by Imperial patrols. There, Jake rebuilt his workshop, bigger this time with more than one bench. He wasn't the only mechanic anymore. Dozens of engineers, refugees, former soldiers, and young minds with nothing left to lose came to join them. It wasn't an army. It wasn't even a rebellion. It was something stranger, stronger, a reclamation. They called it the Iron Reclaim, not just for Vira's limbs or the ship or the war, but for the idea that even the discarded could be reforged into something unbreakable. Jake found himself at the center of it, though he had never asked for such things. His hands were still covered in grease. His tools were still worn smooth from use. But now people came to him for direction, not just repair. And still, every night when the last torch was put out and the last drone powered down, he found Vyra sitting at the edge of the hangar, watching the stars in silence. "I used to think the stars were only for those born above them," she told him one night, her voice quieter than usual. "And now? Now I know they're just waiting for someone bold enough to claim them." Jake sat beside her, resting his back against a crate of fusion coils. "You ever think we'd end up here?" he asked. She shook her head. "When you found me, I didn't think I'd survive the night." He looked at her, at the silver lines of her legs beneath the battle cloak, at the fire still buried behind her eyes. "I didn't save you," he said. "You refused to die. I just gave you a place to stand." She smiled at that, rare and real. "You gave me more than that, Jake. You gave me the future." And then she leaned in, her forehead against his, her breath warm in the stillness. No kiss. No declarations. Just a moment shared by two souls who had been buried and now stood taller than the empires that cast them out. Above them the morning star gleamed. Soon it would fly again. Not for war, but for every world still waiting in silence, for every voice that had been broken, for every heir not born to power, but made in its ashes. Because Vyra of the Iron Reclaim did not rise alone, she brought the fire with her, and Jake, the man who rebuilt fallen things, would never let her fall again.